Welcome to the Inside Story. I'm Billy Hollowell, and today we are tackling a big issue. It's a term you very likely heard again and again, especially recently. It's Christian nationalism. And I'm joined today by Jon Brown, a reporter with the Christian Post. He's going to break it all down for us. How you doing today, Jon?
I'm doing great. Good to be with you.
Well, good to have you here. I always love getting a chance to chat with you, and you do a great job breaking these complex stories down. And this is certainly a very complex story. Let's start with the biggest challenges. When we're talking about Christian nationalism today, when we're discussing it, what are some of the biggest barriers and challenges to that discussion?
Well, I think the biggest hurdle is the fact that people define it differently. So lots of Christians, they're struggling to even talk about it with each other because no one really seems to agree on what Christian nationalism is. And I think many on the left are using that confusion to demonize traditional Christian beliefs and shut them out of the public square altogether.
Yeah, well, and I think that is, when it comes to this issue, when somebody says Christian nationalism and you hear the term or you read it or you see it in a headline, it's very difficult to know what in the world people are talking about, right? I mean, you even have some Christians who embrace the term and they explain why and they give a definition. There are 35,000 different definitions for Christian nationalism. And yet, some people, particularly on the secular left, will act as though there's only one definition and that it's very clear. But it doesn't seem like there is clarity there. And so, with that, in light of the fact that it's mostly, not totally, but mostly secular liberals who will use this terminology, what should Christians take away from the fact that it's that group, it's the secular left that is largely focusing on this issue of Christian nationalism?
Well, I think the left is trying to conflate right wing extremists with average Christians. I think that's ultimately what's going on. A political reporter recently claimed that anyone who believes that our rights come from God is a Christian nationalist, which would lump Thomas Jefferson in there. And he wasn't exactly a fan of Jesus. So I think ultimately they're trying to broaden the definition of domestic terrorism to include normal Christian beliefs, which is really concerning because we've seen the DOJ going after Catholics just for things like protesting outside abortion clinics. I think they want to shut Christians up and just get them out of politics.
Yeah, and that is, it's interesting. I've been covering stories now. I really started, probably it's been about 12 years that I've been doing this, and the very much so in the beginning, some of the atheist organizations, those groups that are out there very frequently, their goal was, it seemed, to kind of push Christianity out of the mainstream. And now culture is kind of moving out of the Christian realm more into this secular obsession with the self, and so it becomes easier to do these sorts of things. It feels like the strategy has shifted. But to your point, I mean, Jesus himself, God himself, would be a Christian nationalist, essentially, based on this idea. Of course, our rights come from God. We know that as Christians. The Bible says that. So the $1,000 question here, and I was hinting at this before with the different definitions, but what does Christian nationalism actually mean when somebody says it? What do they mean?
Well, Mark Tooley recently wrote a really great article about this. We published it at the Christian Post. He laid out the key differences between Christian nationalism and Christian conservatism. He defined Christian nationalists as people who believe that there should be some form of state established Christianity, whereas Christian conservatives are people who want to influence the culture, but they're basically classical liberals and they want the state to remain neutral on those things. And I think a lot of people are conflating these two groups, and I think that's been a huge source of confusion. And as I said, I think the left is really using that for their goals.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it is a huge source of confusion, and I think it becomes, whenever something has 1,000 definitions or people can use it in different ways, my eyebrows raise, because we've seen this again and again. If you can label people and shame them, you can silence them. And that, I think, is a very unfortunate political tool that is often used. And it very much feels, not that every single person using the term means that or is trying to do that, but there are certainly people, it feels, in politics who are trying to do that. Um, would you say, based even on that definition and what Mark Tooley was saying, is Christian nationalism a real threat in any way? Because it has been said that it's the greatest threat. I mean, some people are acting as though it's the biggest thing facing America right now, or is it a conjured sort of construct?
I definitely think it's the term's being used as a political bludgeon against any Christian who has biblical beliefs and wants to see those reflected in the public square. People want leaders who reflect what they believe, and I don't think it's fair to demonize Christians for wanting the same thing. But obviously, there are forces who oppose what we believe as Christians, especially regarding hot button issues on sexuality and gender. Um, I think that's just going to escalate as the left continues to embrace things that go directly against what the Bible teaches. And we need to be prepared for that. I do think, though, that there is a segment of Christians who believe it's our job to take political power and transform institutions. Pastor John MacArthur recently spoke out against that. He warned against getting carried away by this utopian attempt to usher in God's kingdom through politics. And I agree that that's mistaken. But that doesn't mean
Yeah.
we should be involved in politics and the culture. And I'm pretty sure MacArthur wasn't saying that. He urged Christians to vote for righteous leaders, but we can't put our hope in that. I don't view politics in a utopian sense, but in the temporal sense, we should do what we can do to promote our values, and that's the whole point of politics. And maybe we'll succeed in America, maybe not, but we should still try. But either way, Jesus wins, so it doesn't matter in the end.
I love that. Yeah. Either way, Jesus wins, and I think that is the part we do forget sometimes. And yeah, that's been my assessment. Yeah, is there a portion of people who are out there somewhere that are doing the things you described? Absolutely. Do I interact with them frequently? I do not. I think most people don't, but they are out there. And look, there's also the danger, and this is important to know in general, of putting anything above our faith, putting politics above our faith. That is a problematic thing from a spiritual perspective. And by the way, look, that actually happens way more in the secular world, right? Atheists, agnostics, when they don't have God, politics and what's happening in the temporal sense, that comes first, right? And so it's interesting because nobody's walking around accusing people of being atheist nationalists or whatever for their views and wanting to see their perspective be represented. It's just a natural human thing that you do, right? You want to see your leaders reflect what you believe, the policies reflect what you hold to be true. And so one of the reasons, though, that we're here talking about this is that you recently watched Rob Reiner's God and Country documentary, and you did a really fascinating review, which people link to in the description on that. What can you tell us about God and Country?
Yeah, I contributed about $10 to its whopping $38,000 opening weekend. I laid out some of my concerns, as I said in the review that you mentioned, but what troubled me the most was how it lumped all sorts of different Christians together and just sort of painted them all in a negative light. It implied people like John MacArthur and Billy Graham were the same as the guys at Charlottesville or the people who stormed the Capitol on January 6th. And by the end, it was clear that anyone who isn't on board with the illegal immigration or the LGBT agenda, it implied they're not Christians. So, as I said before, they're trying to broaden this term to include typical Christian beliefs, and I think it's a political tactic.
Yeah, well, absolutely. And again, it's coming out during a political year, so not shocking to assume it's even the film itself has an aim in that regard. Um, and you kind of said it, here, but what were there any other elements of it specifically, even scenes? I mean, you just mentioned a bunch that concerned you, and would you recommend that Christians go out and watch it, right? Just to get a sense of maybe what's in it.
I would. I mean, absolutely. If only to just get a sense of what, a lot of people on the left mean when they use the term. I think one of our major tasks as Christians moving forward is to really strive for clarity when it comes to how Christian nationalism is defined, because the term's being weaponized because of the lack of clarity. And, if Christians are going to push back against it, I think we need to be clear in terms of what we mean by it.
Yeah. And also, there's a war on language and words, right? We know that language and words are constantly used to change the feelings about what is happening. We see this a lot in the life debate. It happens across the spectrum where if we can control the words and use them in a very specific way, we can actually control people's emotions and then their reactions to things. And so that needs to concern us. And I think, again, your eyebrows need to raise when people do not agree on a definition, because if I'm using a term and 10 people are hearing that term and thinking very different things, then I think we have a problem there. And so I would encourage people to head on over, read the review you did on God and Country. And I love what you said there, just about having a sense and knowing, it's easy to criticize things, but it's better to criticize them when you understand exactly what you're criticizing. You've seen it, the contents of it. And so, John, as always, just really appreciate you coming on the show today.
Thanks so much. Good to be with you.
Everyone else, make sure you tune in next week for another episode of The Inside Story. In the meantime, head over to thechristianpost.com. You can read that review and plenty of other news from Jon and the amazing reporters at The Post. We will see you all again next week.